A heavy fog, soaked with salt and gunpowder, enveloped Chesapeake Bay on the night of September 14, 1814. Cold rain lashed the deck of the small vessel anchored a few miles from shore, but the man gripping the wet railings seemed to notice neither the cold nor the damp. His name was Francis Scott Key. He was 35 years old, a successful lawyer, a poetry lover, and, at that moment, an involuntary spectator to one of the most dramatic spectacles in the history of the young American nation. Around him was not just night. It was a darkness rent by flashes that made the very water beneath the keel tremble. Somewhere in that gloom lay Fort McHenry, the last bastion separating the world's most powerful war machine, the British Empire, from the city of Baltimore. If the fort fell, the city would fall. And if Baltimore fell, just a few weeks after the British had already put Washington to the torch, the very existence of the United States of America would be in grave doubt. Key peered into the darkness until his eyes smarted. Each bursting shell, each fiery trail of a rocket, was for him not merely a flash of light, but a beat of his heart. He knew that as long as the shells were bursting, the fort was resisting. But what frightened him most was not the cannonade, but the possible silence. Silence would mean only one thing: resistance broken, and the history of an independent country ended almost before it began. To understand the full depth of despair and hope that gripped this man on deck, one must rewind time a little and look at the picture that brought him to this point in space and time. The War of 1812, which many contemporaries called the Second War of Independence, had by then been going on for 2 years. It was a strange, chaotic conflict, born of trade disputes, forced impressment of sailors, and geopolitical ambitions. The young republic challenged the mistress of the seas, but by the end of the summer of 14, the situation for the Americans was catastrophic. Just a few weeks before the night in question, a British landing party under the command of Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross accomplished the unthinkable. They entered Washington. The American militia, poorly trained and disorganized, scattered at Bladensburg, opening the way to the capital for the enemy. The British did not just enter the city, they staged a demonstrative act of retribution. The Capitol and the White House were put to the torch. President James Madison and the government fled, saving documents and national relics. The smoke from burning Washington was visible for many miles, and this black column became a symbol of national humiliation. It seemed that the experiment called democracy had failed. It was in this atmosphere of universal fear and uncertainty that Francis Scott Key embarked on his mission. He was not a soldier, he was a negotiator. His friend, the elderly and respected physician Dr. William Beans, had been detained by the British on charges of disturbing the peace and was being held aboard a Royal Navy ship. Key, with the support of government agent John Skinner, went into the very lair of the enemy, to the flagship of the British fleet, to secure the doctor's release. They found the British squadron at the mouth of the Potomac River. It was an imposing, overwhelming sight, a forest of masts, a palisade of cannons, impeccable discipline. Everything spoke of the might of an empire that had only recently crushed Napoleon Bonaparte himself in Europe and now turned its full gaze on its former colony. Key and Skinner were received aboard the flagship _._0_. The British officers, intoxicated by their easy victory in Washington, were polite but arrogant. At the dinner table, amidst silver and crystal, they made no secret of their plans. The next target was Baltimore, a wealthy trading port that the British called __1_ because of the privateers based there. Negotiations for Dr. Bean's release were successful. Key presented letters from wounded British soldiers cared for by Americans, which softened the command's stance. General Ross agreed to release the doctor. But an unforeseen problem arose. Key and his companions had seen and heard too much. They knew about the plans to attack Baltimore. They saw the troop deployment. "You are free, gentlemen," the British informed them with a cold smile, "but you cannot leave us until we have finished with Baltimore." They were transferred to a small vessel used for negotiations and placed under guard at the rear of the British squadron. Thus, the lawyer became a prisoner of circumstance, forced to observe the demise or triumph of his country from the front row of the orchestra, unable to intervene. Baltimore, unlike Washington, was not going to surrender without a fight. The city understood it was next. Residents, from free citizens to slaves, came out to build fortifications. Trenches were dug, redoubts erected. The harbor entrance was blocked by sunken ships, creating an artificial reef that prevented deep-draft British battleships from approaching the city closely. Key to the defense was Fort McHenry, a star-shaped fortification jutting into the bay. The fort was commanded by Major George Armistead, a man of iron will and determination. A year before these events, Armistead placed an order that would play a decisive role in this story. He approached local seamstress Mary Pickersgill with an unusual request. The major wanted a flag over the fort of such dimensions that, as he put it, the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. It was a challenge. It was a gesture. Mary, along with her daughter, nieces, and an assistant, worked day and night. The flag was so enormous, 30 feet by 42 feet, that they had to sew it on the floor of a neighboring brewery, as no other room could accommodate the entire fabric. 15 stripes, 15 stars, each almost 2 feet in size. It was not just a banner, it was a huge canvas of national pride, sewn from 400 yards of the finest English wool. When the British Armada approached Baltimore, this giant flag had not yet been raised. It was raining, a squally wind was blowing, and a smaller storm flag, more suitable for inclement weather, hung over the fort. But the very presence of a garrison ready to fight irritated the British command. On the morning of September 13th, all hell broke loose. British ships, equipped with powerful mortars and the latest weapons of the time, Congreve rockets, anchored about 2 miles from the fort. It was a perfectly calculated position. Their guns could reach the fort, but Armistead's old cannons could not reach the ships. A bombardment began, designed to break the defenders' spirit. From his small vessel, Francis Scott Key heard this monstrous roar. The sound of 200-pound bombs exploding was deafening. The sky darkened with smoke, but was immediately illuminated by an ominous red light. Congreve rockets, with their characteristic whine and fiery tails, traced arcs across the sky. It was a psychological weapon, terrifying in its unpredictability and visual effect. For a person of the early 19th century, this spectacle was akin to an apocalypse. The ground trembled. It seemed as if the very air was on fire. Key saw shells falling into the fort. He knew that about 1,000 people were inside. They had no reliable bunkers, only earthen ramparts and brick walls. Each flash made his imagination paint pictures of destruction. He saw American cannons trying to respond, but their cannonballs splashed into the water, falling short of the British ships. It was an agonizing feeling of helplessness, to see darkness engulfing light, to see brute force methodically grinding down hope. The British tactic was simple and brutal. They did not plan to storm the fort head-on. They wanted to silence it with massive fire so that the fleet could then enter the harbor unhindered and turn its guns on the city itself. The internal conflict tearing at Key during these hours was no less intense than the cannonade outside. He was a man of his word, of law, and of faith. War itself was abhorrent to him. Earlier, he had even opposed declaring war on Britain, considering it a mistake. But now, looking at the burning horizon, all political disagreements vanished. Only a feeling of deep, visceral connection to his land remained. He understood that beyond the fort's walls, it wasn't a question of borders or trade tariffs being decided. It was a question of dignity. Could a people who proclaimed that all men are created equal defend that right in the face of monarchical power? Or was freedom merely a beautiful phrase that crumbled to dust at the first clash with organized force? Time dragged on unbearably slowly. Day turned into evening, evening into night, but the cannonade did not cease. On the contrary, it intensified. The British Admiral Cochrane, irritated by the defenders' resilience, ordered an increase in fire. At one point, some British ships attempted to approach closer under the cover of darkness, to land troops or deliver a more precise strike. But the defenders of Fort McHenry and neighboring batteries noticed the maneuver. The heavens opened. American cannons, finally having the enemy within range, opened a barrage of fire. The water boiled around the British barges. The roar became unimaginable. It was a moment of peak tension, and then, deep in the night, everything suddenly stopped. The silence that fell over the bay was heavier and more terrifying than any noise. The roar of the guns provided information. The battle was ongoing. The fort was alive. The silence offered nothing. What did it mean? Had the fort surrendered? Had Armistead raised a white flag to save his men from senseless annihilation? Or had the British, having exhausted their ammunition and failed to achieve success, decided to retreat? Francis Scott Key and his companions peered into the darkness, trying to discern any sign. But the torrential rain and gloom concealed everything. These were the longest hours of Key's life. He paced the wet deck, listening to the lapping of the waves. His imagination painted the British flag already flying over the bastions. He thought of his loved ones, of a future that now seemed so fragile. It was in this darkness, in this uncertainty, that the special state of mind requiring an outlet was born. It was not the state of a triumphant, but the state of a man praying for a miracle. Questions swarmed in his head, but the main one was, is it still there? Finally, the sky began to lighten. Dawn on September 14th was approaching. The rain began to subside, the fog slowly dissipating over the water. Key stood at the rail, armed with a spyglass. There was still too little light. He could only see vague outlines of the shore and fortifications. His heart pounded in his chest. He waited. The wind, lazily stirring the ship's sails, needed to do its work. And then, a gust of morning wind struck towards the fort. The fog ripped apart. What Key saw made him freeze, and then exhale with such force as if he hadn't breathed all night. Over Fort McHenry, there was no white flag of surrender. There was no British, quote, zero. There, against the gray morning sky, proudly and defiantly waved that very giant banner, sewn by Mary Pickersgill, huge, vibrant. Despite the holes and tears from shrapnel, it caught the morning wind. It was the underscore, quote, underscore, one, underscore, triumphantly soaring over the ruined, but not surrendered, ramparts. At that moment, something more than mere military fortune occurred. For Key, this flag ceased to be just a piece of cloth indicating territorial belonging. It transformed into a living symbol of survival and resilience. The paradox of the situation was that it was the threat of complete annihilation that filled this symbol with real meaning. Until that night, the flag was an attribute of the state. After that night, it became the soul of the nation. Emotions overwhelmed the lawyer. He reached into his pocket and felt an old letter envelope. He had no inkwell or table. He simply leaned against a barrel or a railing and began rapidly jotting down words that came to mind. The lines landed on the paper, dictated by the rhythm of the battle still echoing in his ears. "Quote 2, he wrote, addressing an invisible interlocutor, perhaps himself or all future generations. He described what he saw with his own eyes. Quote 3, quote 4. These images were not poetic metaphors but a documentary record of reality. But the main thing in the poem was not the war, but the flag. The flag that was underscore, quote, underscore, 5 underscore. This assertion, underscore, quote, underscore, 6 underscore, became the central core of his message. It was an affirmation of life against death, order against chaos, freedom against tyranny. When the British fleet, realizing the futility of further siege and having suffered losses, began to weigh anchor and move downstream, Key's work was almost complete. He continued to edit the text as their ship returned to shore. Stepping onto solid ground in Baltimore, his first order of business was to finish the poem in his hotel room. Interestingly, the text itself was not conceived as a song. It was a poem titled Defense of Fort McHenry. However, the rhythm of the verse perfectly fit a popular tune of the time. And here lies another historical irony bordering on paradox. The melody, which would soon merge with Key's patriotic text, was called underscore, quote, underscore, 8 underscore. It was the anthem of a London gentleman's club, a drinking song celebrating wine and love. In fact, the future national anthem of the USA was set to the tune of a British entertainment song. But there was its own logic in this strange combination. The culture of the young country was melting down the heritage of the old world, filling it with completely new, revolutionary content. The effect of the poem's publication was instantaneous. The text was printed in leaflets, then in Baltimore newspapers, and soon throughout the country. It struck a nerve in society. Americans, humiliated by the burning of Washington, desperately needed a symbol of victory and hope. The story of how the flag withstood hurricane-force fire gave them that symbol. The song spread like wildfire. It gave people words to express that complex feeling of belonging to a whole that was just beginning to form. However, the underscore, quote, underscore, 0 underscore, path to official anthem status was long and arduous. For over 100 years, the song remained a folk, military, but not a national anthem. Officially, the U.S. Congress approved it in this status only in March of 1931. During this time, the flag celebrated by Key went through many trials. The number of stars changed, but the essence, laid down on that September night, remained unchanged. The resonance of the events of that night extends far beyond the history of one war. The story of the anthem's creation teaches us an important lesson about the nature of patriotism and symbols. True symbols are not created by decrees from above. They are born in the crucible of trials, in moments of crisis, when the very existence of a community is called into question. Francis Scott Key was not writing propaganda. He was capturing a moment of truth when fear turned into resolve. His question, "Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?" is not just a rhetorical device. It is an eternal question addressed to every generation. Freedom and independence are not a given, received once and for all. It is a state that must be reaffirmed every day, every morning, by checking if the banner yet waves over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Today, the original flag itself is kept in the National Museum of American History in Washington. It is tattered, faded, its size reduced because in the 19th century, people often cut pieces from it for souvenirs, a barbarism dictated by love. But millions of people who pass by it see not just old fabric. They see what Key saw at dawn after a night of bombardment. Proof that even in the darkest hour, when all seems lost, resilience of spirit can triumph over brute force. Thus, the circle of this story closes. We return to the wet deck of a small ship in Chesapeake Bay. Francis Scott Key puts away his spyglass. He is tired, exhausted from a sleepless night, but a calm confidence shines in his eyes. The roar has ceased. The smoke has cleared. The world has changed, though externally everything remains the same. Britain did not lose the war that day, and America did not definitively win it. There were still battles ahead and a peace treaty in Ghent. But mentally, spiritually, victory was achieved right there. The nation found its voice, a voice born from the roar of cannons and the silence of dawn to resound through the ages. And as long as people remember this moment of transition from fear to hope, the story of that night will remain alive, reminding us that the darkest hour is always before dawn.